Hello future people, Jason the Bruce here with Getting Tabled, and welcome to another Getting Tabled guide. And today, we're going to focus on paint brands. For people that are relatively new to the hobby, one of the things that appears to confuse them most is the fact that there's several different companies making what to them appears to be the same product. Now, they're not the same product, but at the surface they look like they are. So we're going to be addressing that today. To the rest of us, there's preferences that we have, there's different companies that we support, and there's certain companies that we don't like. Sometimes we project that more than we should when we're supposed to be giving advice. So I'm going to be trying to focus in on who these companies are and what somebody that's new to the hobby needs to take into consideration. There are some paint brands that are really good at certain things. There are some brands that are really bad at certain things. If you're someone that's completely new to the hobby, and you go into a dollar store and see these craft paints, why can't I just use those? Ironically, you will actually find some people that have used those. But that's not a path you want to go down as someone that's new to this hobby. It's much, much harder because they're just not designed for it. We're not going to be touching on that today. This is just a simple piece of advice. Look, if you want to challenge yourself later on and try to make these things work, you can. But don't expect that this is going to go easily. You've got a lot of work that you have to do to make them work for you. I'm going to try and present this the way that I have some other hobby videos in the past, taking my own personal bias out of this, and just talk about a couple of the different companies out there, generally what they're good at, generally not what they're not good at, and then we'll kind of focus in at the end to our centralized message. Now, for those of you that can't be bothered waiting, here's the TLDR. There's no such thing as the perfect paint brand. It doesn't exist. Let's start off with, for most people, what is the most obvious. Let's start with Citadel. So, here we are on the Games Workshop website. I'm starting with the Games Workshop website because I'm trying to start off with a centralized theme, and it's probably the easiest way to go. When you have your Citadel paints, you have several different things here. Air paints are essentially thinner versions of their regular paints that are designed to use in an airbrush. Here's the thing with Games Workshop paints. All Games Workshop paints come in a bottle that looks something like this. It's a pot. You're supposed to open this up. It kind of has a little thing in there. Although they are the first to tell you that you shouldn't be painting directly from the pot, these are designed so that you can paint straight from the pot. Generally speaking, most people hate these pots for good reason. You will, however, find there are a small percentage of the community that actually don't mind them. They've never had a problem with it. They don't understand why people have an issue with them. And I'm not going to say that those people are wrong. I'm only going to talk about my own personal experience. Generally speaking, these pots are not airtight, and your paint tends to dry out much faster than a dropper. They both hold roughly the same amount, roughly. That, however, doesn't mean that these paints are not good. They are. Not all of them, but they are good. What are Games Workshop paints really good at? Most of their base range is extremely well done. It tends to have a much thicker opacity, so it's not as thin and see-through. You can get a much more solid colour, which when you're new is definitely helping out. You still need to thin them like everything else. In their base ranges, you will find everything from metal colours to regular colours, all the way through. There's 50 different paints here. The only thing I'm going to tell you about these particular colours is, honestly, 90% of their whites are rubbish and not worth touching. White Scar in particular is absolutely horrible. Corax White is even worse. You will find that there are fans of Corax White, one of which is a friend of mine. Hi, you know who you are. We've had debates over this topic several times, and he knows that I disagree with him on this subject. It's very, very chalky. Look, you can get them to work. There are specific paint mixer machines that you can get that will help you do that, but again, it's another job that you need to have to make a paint work, whereas there are other brands that just have whites that work. It seems to be there's an issue with trying to make it more opaque and work as a base. Kind of means that it doesn't hold up as well, because the ones that do work tend to be a lot thinner, which is another problem that we will cover later. White's one of those colours that's just difficult. Yellow is another one of those problems that's just difficult. There's a couple of them, but they are the main two. One thing I will touch on though, Rakarth Flesh. This is one of my favourite colours in the entire range. Honestly, their base range, with the exception of the whites, is great. From your base paints, your next level is your layer paints. These go over the top of your base, either for a highlight, or in some cases, if you're trying to get to a specific colour, you'll use the base as a flat standard, and then you'll use the next colour to go over the top of that. You've got everything in here in every colour that you could ever possibly imagine. So from here, you go into shades. A shade is a wash. Games Workshop shades are very popular. They're very popular for a reason. I don't know any of them that are bad. But they just work. Look, a wash is a wash. Agrax Earthshade gets referred to as God Wash, as does Null Oil. They're probably the two main ones. Just make sure that you're not buying one of the gloss washes unless you want it to be shiny. It does say gloss in the bottle, but you don't often notice it because you just look for the name or you just look for the colour and you're just not thinking. So just be careful there. Technical paints are not just a straightforward, you use them for this, because it depends on what they are. Storm Shield, for example, is a varnish. Aquarelle on Earth, Astronite Granite, and most of these are actually designed for basing. The ones here that kind of look like they're patchy are actually crackle paints. If you put them on thickly, they'll crack and make it look like broken earth. The ones that are kind of, look like paint splatter are more sandy and they're a bit thicker, but it's just very textured. Army Painter is a company that has been around for a very, very long time, actually. The Army Painter specifically tries to focus their stuff on just getting stuff onto the table quickly. They do tend to be thinner than Games Workshop. That's not a bad thing, though. It just means that in order to get a solid colour, you'll have to do a couple of layers. But to be fair, you should be doing a couple of thin layers anyway. Not necessarily 2 thin coats with Army Painter. It's probably going to be 3. Depends on the colour. There is one product that Army Painter have that, in my opinion, are the best on the market, bar none. Welcome to their washes. Genuine opinion here. The best on the market by a huge margin. I mentioned earlier the God Wash, which is just a slang term that the community have come up with for certain colours. Strong Tone is your God Wash. It's as close to the original that you will find. Honestly, all 3 of these, soft, strong, and dark, are all very, very good. There is a dip tone that you can get as well, which is not the same thing, but people confuse them quite frequently. I am not talking about those. They tend to be very Marmite, and I'll touch on those again a little bit later. So they are your regular colours. You also have washes for just general colours. So you've got a green, you've got a red, you've got a blue, you've got a purple. Army Painter also have a couple of effect war paints, which is their equivalent to the technical ones we were covering earlier. These ones are a little bit more obvious. So you still got a couple of mediums. Brush on primer. I'm not a fan of pretty much any brush on primer, personally. But apparently this works fine. But I just don't use them because I'm not a fan of them. You've got varnishes, obviously, more mediums, and there's a glowing, glistening blood, which is really nice. The quick shades are the dips that I spoke about very briefly a minute ago. So, the idea of these, it's actually a very old idea that still has some weight, but this is a very old technique that a lot of people just don't use anymore. Which basically was, once that you painted it, you kind of put the model upside down, dipped it in these, shook off the excess, and then just let it dry. And it will dry in the recesses. It kind of pulls into the recesses, and unlike a wash that can kind of just stay where it is, this kind of, as it dries, pulls back into the recess. When it finishes, it does tend to have a bit of a glossy look to it. This tends to be a very Marmite product that, again, you either like or you don't. From here, you have your acrylic wall paint, so you have pretty much every colour imaginable that you could ever possibly want. These were relaunched a couple of years ago now. And as I said, generally speaking, you're going to find that these are thinner than your Games Workshop ones. That doesn't make them bad. But you're going to find very quickly that there's certain colours that you will like and certain colours that you won't like. Vallejo is probably the number 2 company that you will find get mentioned. Vallejo genuinely are one of the big people in paints for a reason. They are very good. Personally, I would say they're as good as Games Workshop. I would put them on a level tier. But that doesn't mean their paints are the same. Vallejo have so many paint lines and so many colours that you could get lost in them forever. They have specific paints for airbrushes and specific paints for brushes. There are some things that actually work for both. But generally speaking, you want one or the other. This model, Metallic Air, comes in with the silver labels like that. Honestly, I consider these to be the best metals on the market. They are not as thick as the Games Workshop ones. But personally, I have found that means that I can use these straight from the pot without having to mix them down, because they're already quite good. They aren't quite pigment heavy, which you kind of want with a metal if you're doing regular metal. Personally, I love these. Your 2 main paint ranges are model colour and game colour. The main difference is colours, and that may sound like a really boring thing to say, but honestly it is. Model colour is designed to have more real world feeling colours, so it's more toned down, more what you would see in the real world. Where game colour is what you would tend to find in more of a sci-fi fantasy setting. If you're looking at stuff from fantasy, it tends to be over the top, and maybe that's the look that you're going for. The game colour range is not as big as the model colour range. They do work together well, but that's the main differences between the two. Vallejo also have their own washes. These particular ones are more of your real world ones, so that's where you're getting your rusts, your greens and so forth. But the model colour and the game colour both have their own washes for their specific colours. Onto a company that we've touched on a couple of times recently. AK Interactive re-released their acrylic paints 6 months ago now. Generally speaking, it tends to be about as thick as the Games Workshop stuff, maybe even a little thicker sometimes. Very good quality paints. The coverage is very good. AK Interactive are another company that you do see around a lot. Not as often as you see around Vallejo and Army Painter, but if you can get them in the area, it's definitely a company I'd recommend. Scale 75 is a company that you are fast starting to hear more and more. Scale 75 have a range that definitely feels unique to itself. When it comes to the Scale 75 stuff, the coverage is very, very good. The finished result tends to be extremely matte. Not to a point where it looks odd with the other colours, but it definitely looks unique. Contrast, when it was released, was trying to do a easy paint scheme. The idea is that you have a very pale colour to start with, and you use these paints that it's like an acrylic ink. Well, it is an acrylic ink that will tone it, and as it dries, the recesses that have more will be slightly darker than everything else that is upper, and it kind of auto shades and highlights your colours. The downside of these products is that if you have a model that's got very flat areas, then it tends to come off very blotchy and it doesn't really settle very well. But genuinely a game changer, especially when it comes to people that are new to the hobby. If you're just learning to paint, this is, without question, the easiest way to start. The downside of these paints is that if you just paint it on really, really thickly, which is what you're supposed to do, and then just leave it and not touch it, it can kind of come off with like your tide lines and where you can see where it's dried first and that sort of thing. You kind of want to, if it's pooling in certain areas, you kind of want to get some of it off with your dry brush and kind of wick it away so that you can kind of control how it's resting and settling. The Instant Colours range is a very similar product. It's not the same product, but it is the same idea. Generally speaking, from the reviews that I've watched so far, it tends to be a little, I wouldn't say thinner, but the contrast of the colour is not as strong. Which is not a bad thing. It means that you can probably control the colours a little more. It's not quite so overwhelming, so you can kind of get a different feel at the end of the day. My suggestion would probably be to go for one or the other. I don't really see much benefit in using both. So there you go. Looking at arguably some of the more popular paint ranges, it's certainly not all of them. But ultimately, when it comes to choosing a paint range, here is my genuine advice. Don't pick a paint range. Buy the colours that you want. Buy the colours that are accessible to you. The best painters that you will find on YouTube, the absolute best painters that you will find, use multiple paint ranges for the different colours where that range has a preference for whatever it is that they're trying to achieve. The exception to that is ones that are sponsored by certain companies, and there's nothing wrong with that. For example, Ungar Heraldez, someone that I'm a massive fan of, is sponsored by Vallejo. So, generally speaking, mostly uses Vallejo products. I can't say he uses them exclusively. I think he does, but I'm not 100% sure, so I could be wrong. But genuinely, mixing ranges is actually a really good idea. Honestly, that's my advice. If you ask in communities, you will get a lot of very strong opinions about which range is good and which range is not. I do have personal biases against certain products, Games Workshop whites for example, but honestly, the advice I'm giving you now is what I see in most of the professional painters that I see. They use multiple paint ranges because all paint ranges have certain things that they do very, very well, and the perfect paint range doesn't exist. Stop looking for it now, because all you're doing is wasting your time. If you've had experiences with any of the paint ranges that we've discussed, or any that I haven't discussed, talk about them down below so that any newbies that come across this video can benefit from the experiences that you've had. Thank you very much for checking out this video. If you're enjoying the content of this channel, please like and subscribe. If you're in a position to do so, please check out patreon.com/gettingtabled. You receive early access to at least 80% of all videos that we put out, and you get access to the video edition of all of our podcasts the day that they're uploaded. If you'd like to check us out on social media, facebook.com/gettingtabled is the most active. We also have a Discord server. You can email our team at gettingtabled@gmail.com. If you're on either Twitter or Instagram, you can find us at gettingtabled. And until next time, play more.